Hello, and welcome to Face to Face. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Marion Blank of Columbia University, and we're going to be talking about teaching children, and more than that, teaching everyone how to read. So Dr. Blank, maybe you can just give us a bit of your background, and you are the director of A Light on Learning at Columbia University. Maybe you can tell us your background and...
I'm a psychologist, a developmental psychologist. I was trained first at the City College of New York, which was a great institution. And then I went to Cambridge, England, and got a PhD in what was called medical psychology, which is a sort of combination of experimental and clinical. And then I came back, and I've been working for many years in developing language programs for children and reading programs as part of language, and particularly for children who have learning problems. But it applies to a much wider audience as well.
So when we're talking about children who have learning problems, you mentioned when we were talking earlier that this is not a small group of children. There are a lot of children in schools who have problems with reading. How big is the problem?
The problem is enormous, and I can't believe how little attention it's received. It's been quite a long number of years. I don't know if that's the right term, but for quite a number of years. The figures in the United States in general, averaging across all states, is that 40% of children are less than proficient in reading. And so they have like a 5-point system. There are more children who have trouble learning to read than who read well, which is mind-boggling. So, and even the best state, which I think is Minnesota, kind of has 30%.
So this is 30% of children who have difficulty with reading,
right,
for their grade level.
That's right, for their grade level. And then people come out and sort of start apologizing for it, sort of saying the test isn't good and da-da-da, you know. But in general, it's a very high figure. And anything that's any other sort of ancillary things that are done show the same thing. For example, when they've done studies in the United States, the average high school graduate in the United States, and 30% of our children don't graduate high school now. That has changed dramatically in the last few decades.
What did it used to be?
I don't know the exact figure, but we had the highest rate in the world at the end of World War II.
Of children who did graduate.
We are now way down. And everybody keeps saying, well, it isn't that we're falling, it's the rest of the world is catching up. But it's 30% of the population not graduating high school is an astronomical figure. And but of those who do, so you're now left with supposedly a more involved population. The average American high school graduate can't read and understand. I can't read with understanding a sixth grade sentence, and can't write a fifth grade sentence.
That seems unbelievable.
That's right.
So you're saying the average high school graduate cannot read and understand a sixth grade sentence? Mm-hmm. What would a sixth grade sentence be?
It's interesting because what happens in reading is that there's a dramatic shift at about fourth grade. It'll vary. In some schools it'll be third, some schools it'll be late fourth. But basically what you have initially is what's called learning to read. And so there's a lot of stress on word analysis and sounding out and so on. And then at fourth grade it shifts, and it's called reading to learn. And if you look at the sentences, and there's a very an area that doesn't receive enough attention. But if you look at the sentences, there's a dramatic shift. So that, for example, whereas you're getting the cat sat on the hat in first grade, at fourth grade it shifts to when the committee met, no decision could be reached, and the meeting was called off.
Now this is fourth grade.
That's right.
Well, I can understand somebody not understanding that.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
Because you're shifting into a real knowledge-based literature, talking about the explorers, in other words, if they'll say, when Columbus did not receive the funds that he expected, he did not give up. He chose to explore a whole set of alternatives.
So this is fourth, fifth grade.
Fourth, fifth grade is when that starts. And the interesting thing is, you see, that you don't speak that way. The only children who hear that kind of language are the very small percentage born in sort of academic homes. But people don't speak that way. Television doesn't have that very much. It does have some of it. And if you take a child who's having trouble in reading, let's say at 4th, 5th grade, and give him a show that theoretically he should like. For example, I once tried it with a history of baseball. Kids love baseball in the United States. I imagine they do in Canada. Yeah.
Why not?
Yep.
Sure.
It gave the history of baseball, and he loved the pictures. He loved seeing the old movies and so. And I asked him to explain what he heard. He could not do a thing. I asked him to imitate a sentence. I would play the tape, play it again. He can't even imitate that level sentence. So they can't process that language, and nothing systematic is being done to help the kids learn to process the language of post-4th grade reading.
Okay. Why is this happening? This great because reading is important. I mean, you said earlier that if you can't read, in many ways it's difficult to get ahead in any area. You know, I have a lot of friends who are in the trades. If you can't read very well, it's certainly difficult to get your papers. Working in a store, you've got to be able to process certain things, and higher level jobs, of course, it's even more.
Yeah. Well, for everyday work, reading is minimal, in fact, and that's why the society's been able to get by, because the schools are reasonably good at ultimately getting kids to 4th to 5th grade, and that's all you need for daily life. Which sounds amazing.
That does sound a bit shocking. So
that's all, like if you have to fill out a form where it says name and so, it's easy. If you have to read a notice, this weekend the electric office will be closed. That's very easy to read.
How about getting your hydro bill or something?
Those are all fit under the sort of under 4th to 5th grade.
Okay.
It's the level of language that you need for an intelligent, educated population. In other words, to discuss issues. It's the level that you need if you want to go on to any university or college training of any sort. And it's the level you need, but that to read any book with pleasure. But that is increasingly going out. It's very rare that kids of this, in our area anyway, that kids of this generation will pick up a book for pleasure.
Yeah. Well, I like to read, but I read spy, mystery, police, CIA kind of novels. And the level of language in all of those books is pretty low. I mean, I don't. It
may or may not be. You have to look. You have to look at it again. You have to see how many.
It's easy reading.
Yes.
And that's why I like it.
Because the thing that makes school reading so difficult and more academic reading is that you need a heavy knowledge base as well as reading skills. So, for example, they did a study a number of years ago. It was very interesting. They took the depiction of a wedding scene and they put it in two forms. One in the terms that we're used to in English, ceremony and bride and gown and so on. And then they took the same text and put it into an Indian setting and changed 10% of the words. And people could not understand it once they saw 10% of the words showing unfamiliar ideas.
So, for example, what would be a word that was
changed? Like a gown or ceremony, or how they called the ceremony, or how they called the person who administered the ritual. So, in other words, it's sort of saying when the priest did something, they would say when the gounda did something. So what happens is you need a knowledge base, and you have to be familiar with the material that you're going to read. So if you're going to read, for example, an article on, let's say, the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have to understand what the system was before, because of what collapse. You have to understand what a collapse in a government system means. You have to understand sort of the actions that were taken. Those are all things that are very heavy knowledge base. And that same thing exists in science, where you're talking about molecules or conservation or whatever. And so if you don't have the knowledge base, you can't read, even if you can read every word.
Is this problem with reading? You said, I think 30% of children have
40%
of children in the States have difficulty reading. Probably similar numbers in Canada. Does that represent a failure to teach reading properly, or does it represent a long-term change in kind of cognitive abilities that people have? And because of pollution, chemicals, and pesticides, our brains are being affected, and we simply aren't able to do the things we used to be able to do.
It's an excellent question, and the answer is both, I think. We don't know. First, in terms of is there a change in abilities? Years ago, children were trained. First of all, they had a more, quotes, boring life. In other words, they didn't have the high-tech stimulation to turn to. So if they got an assignment, for example, and there were regular assignments for memorization in the United States years ago. I'm not arguing that's great or wonderful, but they were. And so, for example, we would go home and we'd have to memorize a times table. Or we'd have to memorize the meaning of 20 vocabulary or whatever. And we were very used to it. When I went to Russia several years ago, it was interesting. They still stress memory. The kids have to memorize 70 to 80 long poems a term. Now, if you demanded that of an American kid, you could give him tons of money. It wouldn't work. They don't have those kind of diligent skills for memorization. So what happens is by just doing something repeatedly, you tend to get better at it because you're doing it intensively, and that existed before. That has been changed. Kids don't do that kind of intensive drill anymore. They wouldn't tolerate it. The parents wouldn't tolerate it. So you don't have an avenue and the thing is, the schools have not adjusted, and they're using their old techniques in watered down form to get the kids to do some of the stuff that they were doing, and whereas they have to use totally new techniques.
Okay. So how does society go about making things better? You mentioned earlier there are official recommendations about what to do with this problem, which is the problem of so many children having difficulty reading. So what are the official...
Well, the official recommendations stem from what's called the reading wars, at least in the United States. And those, which shows you the sort of heated controversy that goes on in this field. But back in the 30s, for years, phonics was the main method of teaching reading, which means you sound out. And when everyone says, well, you don't know the word, sound it out.
Maybe you can just give us a quick example of what phonics would be for people who don't know how. Yeah,
so for almost every child's experienced it. You see the word cat and the child doesn't know it, and you say, so sound it out. And that says...
So you know a C is k.
Yes. And in actual fact, this is just a sort of aside, when you do k, at, you don't come up with cat. You come out with k, at. And what you have to do is then do a kind of cognitive translation, say, well, what's the closest word that could approximate to ka'ata? Because when you do most consonant sounds in English, you come up with an extra vowel. You don't, for example, with s, but with k, you do. You can't say k, you just can't. So anyway, that's sounding out. And people... Anyone who sees a child having trouble reading automatically says, well, just sound it out. That's phonics.
Okay.
Well, that's phonics the way it's been taught. That is not really good phonics in the way of how it should be taught. But so what happened was there was quite a high failure rate. And they brought in what was called whole word teaching, where you just show a word and the child's supposed to learn it. That was a disaster. And so then there was a famous book called Why Johnny Can't Read, by Fleisch, I think was the name. And he attributed it all to whole word, and this was terrible. So they went back to phonics. Then you got the problems again, including lots and lots of complaints from children that it's boring and tedious and they hate it. And it's not a good thing to teach something that is boring, tedious, and is hated. So then a new thing came in called whole language. I don't know if it took over in Canada, but it took over in the States. And that's where you just gave whole books to kids on the grounds that kids learn to speak easily, but no one teaches them. Just give them good books, encourage them, and they'll learn to read. And that was kind of insane because it's a very complicated thing to just look even at the simplest book and try and figure it out. And so that has led to disastrous consequences. California adopted it whole hog, and then their reading failure rate rose to 50%. So California is now one of the lowest states in the nation.
If I can just interrupt here. I don't remember how I learned to read, but I sort of remember how my children learned to read. And I don't remember them even being taught to read. My wife and I would read them books. I remember falling asleep half the time when I was reading these books. And somehow, after that process, they began to read with simple words first, and then they just picked it up. But I don't remember there ever being a real teaching process of phonics or whole language or anything else.
Even in school?
Oh, I don't know what. Well, they could sort of read by the time they went to school.
Okay.
And I'm sure I could as well,
That probably, no one knows the figures, but probably somewhere between 5 and 15% of children pick up reading en passant in this manner. And those are called early readers, and it's great. And what they've done is crack the system on their own. The key is, and everyone uses that term, crack the system. What happens in teaching, for those who haven't got that foundation, is you start giving them clues that you hope will help them crack the system. And what happens is, somehow they piece it together, and kids who are going to have an easy time learning to read, usually within 3 to 4 months, have cracked the system, and which is what your children did on their own. But nobody remembers how they were taught to read. That's one of the problems, because we don't know officially what works and what triggers the system.
So I guess for kids who can't read when they enter school, then in the first year or two, grade 1, grade 2, they should be able to learn how to read.
Yes.
And they're taught through either phonics or one of these other systems.
Yes.
And if they don't learn,
then they're called learning disabled.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't know how to read by the time you're in grade 2 or grade 3, you're way behind the...
But what happens is each parent is sort of told, your child is failing, and he is learning disabled, and he needs special education. And that's the way our system has gone. The only limit on that is that in the United States, at least, you can't have more than 12% of the population learning disabled. So if you're just above the cut of 12%, you can't get the special education. But the special education just does what the classroom does in more isolated, concentrated ways. It doesn't do anything. It's not special.
I guess this is where we come to you.
Yes.
And your field of...
Yeah.
of teaching children and adults, later on,
yes,
how to read. So what is the program or process that...
Well, the program I've developed that is currently out is called Phonics Plus 5. And the reason it's called Phonics Plus 5 is because there are really, I think, 6 skills to reading. And I could just highlight a few of them for you. And then just to anticipate what's going to be coming, we are coming out with a software program, which will make it even easier and more fun to do this, and that's called the Reading Kingdom. But basically, let me give you a couple of examples. In teaching, there are a group of words that, at least in the United States, in the phonics programs, are called renegades, outlaws, exceptions, and so on. And those are the words that are actually... In linguistics are called non-content words. They're words like the and is and was and he and so on, where you can't, it isn't like house and pencil and chair. They're not objects, they're not things, they're not experiences, they're these little words. And they're called exceptions because you can't use the phonic rules to sound them out. So for example, if you wanted to sound out he, it would be he. If you wanted to sound out was, it would be was, if you followed the rules. So the children are told these are exceptions, and they're given almost no instruction in them. They're constantly tested on them with word cards. They hold up the card and say, what word is this, what word is this, what? But these words are extremely difficult. But in fact, if you look at a page of text, those words occupy approximately 60% of any page of text the child will ever see.
That's true. The simplest words are used so often.
That's right. That's because they're the sort of glue of the language. Yeah. They're the matrix. And so in not being taught these words, and they're also processed in different parts of the brain, and for children who have problems learning to read, these words are particularly difficult. So what happens is you're left to stumble over practically every other word if you're a poor reader, because you've never been given help on this very basic issue.
But words like was and he and she and it, the, I mean, after you run past them a few times, don't you just know what they are?
No, you don't.
How come? It seems so simple.
It's because they relate much more to the linguistic structures in our brain, and they're the basis of grammar, and it's just much harder. Now, it's very interesting. For example,
so you mean a child will be reading a sentence when he comes to the word he or the, even in grade 2 or grade 3, that word, will they stumble on it or not be able to say it properly or actually not be able to read?
But all of it, all of the above.
That seems like a huge problem.
It is a huge problem, and it has never been addressed until now. Well, in my stuff, it's very clearly addressed. It's a huge problem, and even if they do recognize it, it's also much slower, so it slows down reading, and anything that slows down reading makes reading very tedious, and it also makes comprehension very hard. So I spend a lot of time in my reading programs teaching these words as opposed to casting them aside and saying to the children they're unimportant. And I teach not only how to recognize them, but their meaning. And most kids with with reading problems have some level of language difficulty. And this tremendously supports their language skills.
So you're teaching a program that you've developed called Phonics Plus 5. Mm-hmm. And it is a different way of coming at the situation.
Right. There's another problem that's very interesting with a very high percentage of children who have reading problems. It's called a naming problem. And what that is that you have trouble coming up with names. Of course, at my age, I have trouble coming up with names. But when I was young, I didn't. It means you look at that and you say, the cup. That's a naming problem. When you see people on the street, you say, I know his name. It starts with P. And then 20 minutes later, you say, oh yeah, Peter. And it's very annoying. Well, a lot of children who have trouble reading have naming problems. Now, a naming problem in spoken language is not a big issue for the most part, unless you're seriously disabled, because you can bypass it. Could I have that thing, please? Okay. You can have that, and so on. But in reading, you have to name what you see. And the other thing is that basically in reading, every word initially is a thing that has to be named. So whereas in spoken language, a naming problem affects only nouns, and nouns are only about 5% of what we say. In reading, every word and so what happens is you can't.
So you mean even after reading it over hundreds of times?
No, not after they read it. The same thing hundreds of times? No, then it gets easy.
Okay. But you've seen the word 100 times.
That's right. Have you ever had trouble remembering a name?
Oh, always.
Okay. So the point is you've done it thousands of times in your life, and now suddenly you don't have that word? Why?
Right.
And it's not. It's very. There's a very interesting test that was developed by a colleague of mine who died a number of years ago, Rita Rudell, and Martha Denkler, who's still at Johns Hopkins University. And it was a naming test, and you just show pictures of objects, very simple, a set of 5 or 6, like a boat, a clock, a comb, and so on. And you have the child. And they vary in order. That's all. And you have the child say them. And they start off. They have boat, clock, comb, house, whatever. And then they get to the third line. And they say, I know, the thing that goes in a boat. They just said it 30 seconds ago. That's what a naming problem is. It isn't a knowledge problem. It's that you can't access the name. And that is a huge problem in reading that is addressed by no reading program.
Is reading something that's very simple, or is reading something that's very complex?
That's a marvelous question. it's for the people who find it easy, it's very simple. What the brain does is amazingly complex.
Yeah, it must
Amazingly complex. And there's a new book coming out by an author from Dehaene, Dehaene. It's not out yet. It's called The Reading Brain. So anybody who wants to find out really what's happening in the layers of the brain will find that book fascinating. And it's, I'll show you, I'll give you an example of something. This is, may I have your pen? That's good. Do you mind if I write this?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. See this? Okay, it's a nonsense word.
Okay, so here's a word.
Yes.
You call it a nonsense word?
Well, it's because it's not a real word.
Okay.
Now you read it.
Thop.
Okay. Now, you don't know it, or you're not thinking about it, but there are actually two TH sounds in English. There's the and the th.
Yeah.
Why did you, without thinking, you didn't say, well, maybe it's thop, or maybe it's thop. You just said, it's thop. Why?
I have no idea.
Okay. The reason is that in English, the harder like it's called the voiced, goes with non-content words. These, there, those, them, the, and so on. The softer TH, where you can feel it if you blow on your hand, I mean, if you put your hand, the softer ones goes with content words, like nouns and verbs and adjectives like think, thimble, thin, and so on. Your brain saw that, and it said it's a new word. If it's a new word, it has to be a content word because there are no new content words. New content, non-content words are a closed class.
I know all of them.
You know all of them, and you know that you know it, even though that you don't know that you know it. And so your brain instantaneously, in milliseconds, shunted that into the content class, and you gave it the content class.
That's why I said th instead
That's
of
right. Now, do you see how fast that is?
Yeah, it was of course.
And effortless.
Even before I said it, I knew what I was going to say.
Yes, of course. It's effortless.
Yeah.
And so you're saying, is it simple? Yeah, for some. But what your brain does is not simple. And the thing is, if there are slight difficulties anywhere along the brain circuitry in any of these, it's going to have enormous, huge effects on reading. And that's what happens with a naming problem. And the only way, for example, to address a naming problem is by repetition. So that I always say to people, I forget everybody else's name, but I at least don't forget my kids' names yet. So in other words, repetition helps. And so when we teach words to children, we get 45 to 50 trials with every new word that we teach, so that they can, once you have the repetition, which you were sort of alluding to, you said if you do it often enough, but you've got to do it in a very systematic, frequent way, and then you can not quite become the same as a child who can do it easily, but very close.
So you've got a situation in the United States where 40% of children have reading problems. Mm-hmm. And those are, I guess, the children that you deal with mainly.
Yes, because that's when the parents feel concerned and come in. So
what kind of success rate do you have with those children?
Generally, very, very high. It's on the website. We have a lot of testimonials on the www.phonics+5 website, and they're all legitimate. I mean, everything. I am often sent from all over the world cases of children who can't read, and our success rate is phenomenal.
Like 70, 80%?
I would say more like 95.
So then what you're saying is it's not difficult to teach children how to read if it's done in a proper way.
Exactly.
Are these? Do you deal with children who are in grade 1 or grade 2, or children who are in grade 7, grade 8, and grade 10?
I deal across the spectrum, and the techniques use the same sort of rationale, but they use different methods at different stages. And I do a lot more work on comprehension. I do a lot of work on comprehension even early on, but I do much more post 4th grade. But for example, in comprehension, that's almost never addressed in any significant way in the early grades.
You mean comprehension isn't addressed?
That's right. Comprehension, you're reading about a cat and he's got a hat and, how difficult could it be? But in fact, what happens is all the work is focused on details. when they do anything approaching comprehension. So they say, well, what color was the cat? Oh, it said the gray cat saw the color, the cat was gray. And they say, and who did he see? He saw the mouse, and so on. And what I had found is that this ends up putting the kids into two groupings. One, the more diligent ones who still don't understand give you back the whole text. They figure the more details I give you back, the better. And little girls tend to do that more than boys, but it's pretty common. And the other is, particularly for the kids who have memory problems and naming problems, they just give up and they say, I don't know. And so what happens is that during the first 3 years, when you could be laying the groundwork for comprehension, very little is done. And so one of the things I also build into the early reading programs is this. And a lot of my work is based on, obviously, the experiences I've had with kids. One day I was doing work on comprehension tests that I've developed. And this boy is 4th grade, learning disabled, very bright. And he says to me, why are you doing this? I said, this is what you have to do in school all the time. He says, I never do this in school. I said, every time they ask you for the main idea in school, this is what they're asking for. He says, oh, the main idea. He says, 8 out of 10 questions are on details, so I can still get an 80%. And without ever understanding the main idea, and I have no intention of ever learning the main idea because it's too hard. So it's only when they get into 4th grade where they can't escape trying to get the main idea, and no one has laid the groundwork for it earlier. So I've developed programs for that as well.
Let's say somebody who's a grade 10, 15, 16-year-old student comes to you, and they have what would their reading problem be? Is it let's take, for example, a newspaper story, relatively simple newspaper story. Can they read it and follow the words, or can they simply read it easily but not understand what it's about? Are those the problems that they face?
It's all of the above, and you have to address each. So that, for example, let's say they read it with a high rate of error. Then I've developed techniques which make them learn to read and with very low rates of error.
What does a high rate of error mean?
Basically, if the child is misreading or stumbling over more than 10% of the text.
So they can't read the words.
It isn't that they can't read them. They can read them. They don't want to spend the time doing it, particularly with the ADD type pattern. In other words, they see a W, it's a long word, so they sort of say, well, maybe it's welcome. All right, and it isn't welcome.
Oh, so they'll just misread it.
They misread to get through the text as fast. I'm giving you one example. They misread to get through the text as fast as possible. And others, so what happens is when they're being taught by somebody, the person says, no, read it again. But when they're on their own, they frequently don't. So you have to get them into a much more effective pattern of reading. And I have techniques for that based on a technique called impress reading, which is well known and is now becoming more popular in the States. But you make the child read again and again and again. And each time, in my technique of it, I make them start from the beginning if they make an error. So what happens is I make the inattention more painful than attention.
Right.
And so that's one. If they can read accurately but don't know what they're reading, then you have other techniques. And basically what I do is I don't know if this will fit in this setting, but I teach them how to essentially headline each paragraph. And I do it by modeling techniques. So what happens is first you show them how to headline a paragraph, which is very hard for them.
And what does it mean?
To headline a paragraph, it's as if you gave a headline. In other words, when you read, let me give you an example. If you saw the headline, baby gets baboon's heart, which is a real headline. It happened a few years ago. Then it stopped, obviously. But baby, tell me what that article is going to be about.
About a baby getting a baboon's heart.
Well, what are the issues that are going to be discussed in there?
How it was done, why the baby needed the heart,
Keep going.
Who the baboon was.
That's right. And
what the problems were.
Yes.
Is it ethical?
You got it.
Yeah.
And so you very often I'll say to people who know how to comprehend, I'll say, why are you going to read it? You knew what it was all about to begin with.
Yeah.
And the reason is because you know most of it. This is the knowledge base that I was talking about, except this is a pretty easy knowledge base. And what you're going to do is get some additional information for your knowledge base. You're going to find out that it was done in a particular hospital that is experimenting with this, and no other hospital is experimenting with it, and so on. So what happens is that headline told you everything. That headline, almost everything. In other words, it laid out the foundation for you. So if you can look at a paragraph, that's easier than the whole article, and you can headline it with operation performed at Maimonides Hospital. That's the first headline.
But how can you do that until you've read the paragraph and know?
Oh, no, you've read the paragraph. Excuse me. No, you have them read the paragraph, okay. And then I model it first. I sort of say, this is a possible headline, and so on. Eventually, they take over the task. Or I'll start the headline, and they complete it. And then you take 3 or 4 of the headlines, in other words, 3 or 4 paragraphs. You show it to them and say, now give me a summary of the story. So they're now using the headlines to give you a summary. And then, which is really critical, you take it away and they have to do it from memory. And once you can start holding consciously in memory 3 to 4 complex ideas, you're well on your way to reading comprehension. So it's a step-by-step process. And I start this very young in children. I have a program on the internet called Story Smarts. And this does this with children from 4 years of age up, so that you don't have to wait for the problems in 10th or 12th grade. You can stop it very early.
So if you're able to have a success rate, now, when you say success rate of 90 to 95%, this must be of the kids who stick with it.
Absolutely.
Because a lot must not be able to do it, and so they're just, there's no success there for those who just feel it's hopeless and drop out.
Well, I've worked with some adults, and they're generally very motivated because it'll be for vocational things and so on. But with children, you need, most of the time, it's the parents that do the work. I've outlined what has to be done. All the materials are prepared. They just have to apply it. And most parents are phenomenal when it comes to reading problems. They are so committed. When their child has a reading problem, they will really work with it. But the other thing is I've set it up that they only have to work about 15 to 20 minutes a day. So it's very short. It's very manageable. And many parents say to me, they say, he wants to do the work. They're shocked because they're so used to the fighting that they get with the usual tasks of reading. But once you've helped a child become successful, the motivation to learn to read is enormous. You almost never find a child who is not eager to learn to read. And the only ones who say it are those who've had so much school failure that they can't stand it anymore and they don't even want to think about it. But that's rare. Yeah.
If your programs were adopted into the public school system do you think that it would have a major effect on this problem of so many children being unable to read?
I think it would.
I mean, and it would just be, there wouldn't be help. It would just be in a classroom setting, so it would be the same situation as before, but just a different style and technique.
The actual materials, I think, would work extremely well. But when you put it into a school setting, you hit a problem that is enormous, which is the problem of changing the philosophy of a system. And I've done that. I worked in a school for the deaf in New Jersey, and it took us 5 years to get the staff fully on board. What happened was I was given the children who were failing extremely in serious ways, and the teachers were very motivated. And then what happened? So those teachers said, I'm going to apply this to our other kids, and they did it. And they had the middle range of kids were then exceeding the best kids in the school. So the head of the school decided to put it across the board. Many teachers quit. They said, I run my own classroom, and no one is going to tell me what to teach. But we eventually got it. It took 5 years of a lot. It's a whole different field than developmental psychology. It's the field of group organization and organizational structure and organizational change. And teachers like any group, will tend to be very resistant. So I would be very happy, and several schools are doing it because they know of my work, but I want to make it available to the public because I don't want them to be beholden to the schools to get the information, and that you can do it cheaply, easily, and
So is your stuff available on the internet?
Yes, the program is available at phonics+5.com.
So Phonics plus 5, and it's the word phonics, Phonics, Plus, FIVE,
Yeah.
not the number, .com.
Yeah, and in a few months, it's going to be available in software on the Reading Kingdom, another website that we're coming, and that's going to have a lot of games and other things with it. So
So if people who are watching this, whose children or themselves may have problem reading, they can go to phonics+5.com and get some information.
yeah, a lot, and there's also a lot of information on my blog about programs and techniques and so on.
Now, how do people get to your blog?
It's on the website.
Okay.
It's on the website.
That sounds great. You mentioned briefly when we were speaking before the problem of autism. So maybe you can talk about that with your programs.
It sort of seems far afield, but it isn't, in the sense that one of the huge problems in the field of autism is that the children have serious language problems. It's part of the diagnosis, in fact. If you don't have some issue in language, you almost can't be diagnosed as autistic. And I was asked to consult on many children with autism, and gradually the work got more and more intensive. And I started to work quite a bit with children who couldn't speak. And one of the things that this is just historically the way it happened. I had already had several reading programs out. One was Sentence Master, which is a software program that had been used in the schools a lot. And I was working with a 6-year-old child with autism who couldn't speak. And I said to the father, I've gone as far as I can with all the cognitive and behavioral material that I know. I said, and I can't move him because he doesn't say anything. But I said, I realized that everything I've done in reading can be applied to him if we use writing instead of speaking as the vehicle of expression. I said, are you willing to do it? And he said, sure. And it was amazingly easy to teach the child the language system by teaching him how to use it. First, we taught him how to use the keyboard, and we also taught him how to handwrite. And then we input the language system, because my teaching methods use not simply teaching of words, but it teaches the structure of English and the way sentences are constructed and the way sentences link together. So, for example, I could say to an autistic child later on, I might say, for example, this is a pencil. And I'd say, right, this is a pencil. Or, I'll give you another example. I read a story, a very, very simple story, to an autistic boy that I had been working with, who also did not speak and now was reading and writing. And it was a story of a bus that broke down, and someone came and fixed it and so on. So I said to him, and here's the summary of this story. There was a bus, it could not go, the truck fixed it. And I said, write that. And he wrote the whole thing without my ever repeating it. Now, you could say, did he understand it fully? I don't know. But if you had said to me, could this child hold in mind 3 sentences and write them in order, I'd say never in a million years. So I've seen this over and over again. They have amazing language capacities that people are not capturing, because when someone doesn't speak, we're sort of totally lost. Oh. And reading is an enormous vehicle for getting into their system.
To sort of sum up, probably things are going in the wrong direction. I would think that reading difficulties are increasing in number rather than decreasing.
Yeah.
Is that societal, or is it a failure in the schools, or is it what?
It's probably a mixture of everything, but children today are addicted to high-tech material. They have no interest in reading. And there are people, sometimes things get a little weird. There are people who are claiming that we don't need reading. We're going to become a post-literate society. And therefore it's fine. These kids are sort of ahead of the curve. They're just not reading when everybody's not going to read. But in fact, it's hard to envision a highly sophisticated society that doesn't have access to literacy in its complete form. And so if now in the United States, no one has the exact figures because we are now way behind the curve. So, for example, on international exams and so on, we come in like 25th in reading levels. And then everybody comes out and apologizes and says it's not true. Da, da, da. But the point is, other societies are not losing reading to other sophisticated, developed societies are not losing reading to the extent that the United States is. So we are not a model in this at all. And we are not putting our investment into really developing good reading programs the way we should. We have a program that was started by the Bush administration called No Child Left Behind, which has been a massive disaster. It was a giveaway, of course, to his colleagues and friends. In other words, the people whose textbooks were approved were all his cronies, so they got billions in government funding. But what it did was basically work to support the private schools, because what happened is the better kids, all the effort went into the lowest level kids. The curriculum was dumbed down, and parents whose kids were much functioning well have pulled their kids out of school and say, I can't afford to have my kid not learn. So the private schools have gotten a huge boost. I mean, it was a massive disaster, and it may now be dismantled, I hope.
Yeah. Are there any other points you'd like to bring out about the entire process of reading, the problem, and the solution?
This is totally speculative. One of the things that's amazing was the Harry Potter series. And it has some magic in there that we have to study. Real magic, not just the magic of Harry Potter. Because I have seen kids who could not read that well. I have seen kids who hate reading turn to every book she's come out with. So we almost have been given an example of somebody who's got some very special stuff, because it is, if you do it right, it's still very available. I've just mentioned that as an aside.
Maybe just the idea of giving children stuff to read that they themselves like would go a long way to solving reading problems, because they'd be interested.
It definitely. But the other thing is that if you teach reading early, without failure, the kids like reading. And so if you teach reading and there's failure, you can eventually get the kids to read, but they never like reading. So it's vital to prevent failure. And the way we can prevent failure is only by having really good systems. And the only way I can see it now is to do it before the child gets into school. So I'm encouraging parents to have their kids reading before they get to school, because if they get failure in school, it's disastrous.
Now, that's not a difficult thing to do for many children. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned earlier also that a lot of the problems used to be lower income children had more problems reading, but then you said that in today's world, that's changed and everybody is having problems reading. So it's not only lower income, but that's spreading into...
Yeah. It's a huge problem, and I hope. I mean, I'm trying to do my part to address it. I hope I'll be effective.
Yeah. Are you noticing a change in IQ levels in children coming into school or children throughout schools?
I notice a change in the patterns of cognitive abilities. Officially, the IQs are going up. So I'd love to. I don't know how that's happening and what skills are being tested, and I don't know that literature that well. But the official figures of the IQs are going up. But definitely the types of skills that kids have are different, because rote memory skills are very weak, but certain other kinds of skills, for example, the eye hand for high-tech games is very good.
Okay, well, that's important, because the eye-hand coordination is important.
Yeah.
Okay. How about the impact of television on children and society?
It's enormous, and very few parents are limiting their children. The figures are that the average child in America watches 7.5 hours of television a day. I know it's mind-boggling. 7.5 hours.
Is that true?
Yes, it is true.
Now, the average child, so we're talking about children who are 3, 4, 5, and children who are up to the age of 15, 16, 17?
Probably at 15, 16, 17, they stop because they have other interests.
Yeah.
They'll go more towards the high-tech games, which take hours. So if you put them all together, it stays at that. But the actual watching of television is probably most intense when the kids are young. But yeah, the figure is 7. There's no experience in their lives that competes in terms of number of hours. And years ago, there was a very well-known psychiatrist. He was very good, David Hamburg. And he said, early, probably 30, 40 years ago, he says, the problem of this age is not going to be the usual having to find resources. He said, we have a plethora of things and we've got to cut down. We have to consciously cut down even all the things that are available. Too much food, too much television, too much staying awake. American children are known not to sleep enough, which is a huge problem. So it's a kind of discipline that has to come into the society. And parents have to be very rigorous about restricting television for their children.
Now that the Bush administration is gone and you have a new administration in the United States, are you seeing differences in where your society is going?
I think some differences are definitely present, but I think it's too early to say, and it's too early to say whether they'll have the power, even if they want to change things. Certain things are changed in terms of certain practices in national parks and so on. But on the big issues, nothing has yet changed. And we're still in 2 wars, and which is taking a huge amount of the effort, where the economy is still in terrible trouble. So people aren't, the problems are huge, and people aren't considering these other problems at all, really.
Is the United States, I think everyone would say that today, in today's world, the United States is the number one nation. But with all the problems the United States has, do you think it's going to remain the number one nation, or is it going to be superseded by someone else?
It's hard to predict. There may be no, even if we don't stay at the top, there may be nobody taking over, because I don't know if China or India, which are the alternatives, could or would. It's very hard to say. But certainly, if we don't do some very significant changes in some very basic things, the decline in the United States since the 70s on every major parameter of a social system shows that we're declining. In terms of the...
What are some of those parameters?
The child mortality rate, infant mortality, the educational rate, the economic, the average worker is making less today than he was in 1970. There isn't the number of people in jail. We have the highest rate of people in jail in the world. So everything that you would use to judge a system as, is it okay, has been steadily going down. And if we can halt that and start to reverse it, then we have some hope. But I hope.
Yeah. Do you see any hope? Do you see that starting to happen, or is it not?
I think the critical thing is the media. They are not covering what's happening and what people want. And unless that changes, there's no way to really express. There's a huge source.
Let me give you an example of that. Just a couple of weeks ago, the United States House of Representatives passed the first ever bill regarding climate change. I can't remember the name of the bill. And it was a very weak bill in many people's opinions, but still it was the first step the United States has ever taken, and only passed by the House of Representatives. It still has to go to the Senate. That happened on the same day that Michael Jackson died. There was zero coverage anywhere in the American media about that bill, and we all know about the amount of coverage given to the death of Michael Jackson. And to me, that's because the media literally does not want the public getting involved in the issue of climate change, because it is so important. They want their friends, their owners, the corporations, to be making these decisions by themselves and influencing the politicians, and they don't want the public involved. When you have that kind of a of a media in what's supposed to be a democratic society. How do you move your society ahead?
There's one bright spot there, that a lot of the local programming had been taken away, or was being threatened by being taken away by the Bush administration, and they have been fighting to get it and retain it. And hopefully that will be the source where seeds of change can come, because there's very active local programming throughout the country, and they were constantly losing their spots to big business.
So there is good local programming at some level. Is it the local TV station or public broadcasting? Or
public broadcasting is very much controlled by the corporations. They even now have ads constantly, which is, I think, appalling. It used to be, this was sponsored by X. Now it's 30 seconds of this was sponsored by X, but that's not called a commercial. That's called some information something. So you never know what might happen, but certainly there is a strong desire for that kind of change. And if somebody comes in who can do something, maybe, hopefully.
How about the growing gap between rich and poor, which
that's part of what I said with the decline, and that's awful. It's just awful. I remember they would constantly come out with, in the press, like, we now have 1,000 billionaires. Like, who cares? I mean, what good does that do anybody? But this is really sad. The average American thinks that they are rich when they are not. I mean, the average American thinks they're in the top 20%. They've done studies on this. And the average American thinks that they can eventually make it to the billionaire level, which is crazy. And so while people are doing that, they feel the system is working for them.
Okay, yes. There must be a growing number of people, especially now with what's happened in the last 12 months, who are falling. I mean, we don't see it here, and certainly the media doesn't cover it here, but we've heard that there are tent cities springing up.
Yes.
Where all the people who have lost their homes are going. Is that actually happening?
Yes, yeah. Yes, there's one in California, in the Los Angeles area.
How about in New York?
I haven't seen a tent city in New York. It's really funny because, well, it's not funny. I was born in the Depression, and our mayor at the time was a man called Fiorello LaGuardia, who was incredible. And they did amazing things for the people at that time. And I don't know, and New York has a very different tradition. It's not as good as it used to be that way, but it was a very different city for people who were poor, even in the Depression.
So you mean there was some taking care of people?
That's right. There was so I hope that will continue.
What's happening now in New York? We've heard that, I've never been there, but I hear that...
Terrible!
Yeah, I hear that, for example, New York doesn't have a big homeless problem.
I don't know what happened to them. Bloomberg, who's the mayor, was keen on getting rid of it, and you don't see homeless anymore.
You don't see homeless people.
Yeah, which is nice.
Are there shelters or homes?
Oh, yes, there have always been many shelters, but shelters can be dangerous places, and that's why a lot of people don't want to go there.
But they're not on the street.
They're not on the street.
Dr. Marion Blank, thank you very much. We've been talking about reading issues, teaching children and adults about how to read. And we did a few minutes at the end just talking about society in general. Thanks very much for doing this, and thank you for watching Face to Face.